a lot of the qualities that can kind of make us good, virtuous people. In some ways, we learn those lessons when we're young, often, but throughout our lives by how we interact with animals.
That's beautifully put. You just answered your own question, or if it was a question, that was like perfect.
What did the ancients think about animals? How are their insights helpful in our modern lives? And did Seneca really argue that humans are morally inferior to animals? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, and you're listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today's episode is with Mark Usher, the Lyman-Roberts Professor of Classical Languages and Literature and a member of the Department of Geography and Geosciences at the University of Vermont. With his wife, he has also built, owns, and operates Works and Days Farm in Shoreham, Vermont. His previous books include How to Say No, How to Be a Farmer, Plato's Pigs and Other Ruminations, and a number of children's books, including Diogenes. Today we'll be talking about his most recent book, How to Care About Animals, an ancient guide to creatures great and small. But before we begin, a quick reminder to please check out classicalwisdom.com to learn more about the classics and how to sign up for our free newsletter. Now, how does dealing with animals reveal something about ourselves?
Well, thank you, Mark, for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And we've had a couple of opportunities to do so over the years, but this recent book is kind of, it's a really fun one. I really, really enjoyed it. It's called How to Care About Animals, an Ancient Guide to Creatures Great and Small. And I just thought it was a really interesting premise. But I think as we love to do with the classics, it's always good to question the premise to begin with. So why discuss what the ancient Greeks and Romans thought about animals in the first place? How does that kind of give us insight in our modern lives?
Great question. Well, besides the fact that studying the Greeks and the Romans is my day job, besides that, that's a big part of it. But besides that, the Greeks and the Romans, they were pre-industrialized, they were pre-capitalist, they were pre-postmodern and pre-post-human. So, they of necessity, they live closer to the sources of their survival in general. And animals were a huge part of their daily lives just because of their, pre-industrialized existence. So they depended on animals really way much more than we do. I mean, they didn't have the technology enhanced disconnectedness from natural environments that we experience or can experience really as much as we want to, like we're doing right now, over over fiber optical wires, so there's something that ancient peoples in general have to teach us about animals because of their closer interspecies relationships with them. And the Greeks and Romans wrote a lot, so they wrote a lot about that kind of experience. We have tons of information about indigenous experiences with animals and living close to nature, which is wonderful also, but we don't have the voluminous literature that we have from Greco-Roman antiquity. So that's just an advantage, just part of the dynamics of preservation and historical preservation. But so why not take advantage of it and mine those sources for what they have?
It is so fascinating what you point out, that our modern lives, we are really removed from a lot of animal interaction. And it means that we don't respect how we get our food and how animals are employed in all specs of life. And it really is, when you kind of go out to the countryside, or here in Argentina, you go up to the north and people are living off the land, you really see that kind of dynamic that we kind of just take for granted is not part of our modern lives. But it is important to think about how we should be interacting with all the species of the planet.
Right. I mean, mind you, I mean, we have sublimated our alienation from nature in many, many ways. We sublimated it by having pets. And, I would say that we quote unquote love animals more than we ever did, or animals are in our discourse in our culture, perhaps as much as they always were, but it's a changed relationship with animals. And that's not to say that people who are dependent upon animals for daily existence don't also have pets, cherish them, and have that aspect. But we've kind of not erred, but we've just gone in a direction where I think we've anthropomorphized them and kind of brought them into our world to such an extent that we don't know what it's like to be as we don't know as well as what it's like to be in their world, because we're further removed from it.
I do find, though, that sometimes it's one of those humanizing aspects of studying the ancient world when you see things that are similar. And when you see tombs for pet dogs and people writing about that you realize that the ancients weren't so different from us and that they had their beloved pets and such as well.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of, references and anecdotes of that kind of petification, if that's a word, I just made it up, in these texts, everything from that passage about Ovid, in Ovid, about the pet deer, Cyparissus, and his pet deer that, he's totally like projecting all his human wishes and aspirations onto this animal, and then weeps over it, in Ovid's view, excessively because of him foisting all these human attributes onto it. And then you get that I think it's in the Porphyry passage. Can't even remember my own book. When you write a book, it's like already 2 years old by the time it's published, and you're on to like 5 other things. But I think it's in the Porphyry passage about Crassus, who had a pet eel, and Porphyry remarks how he was. Oh no, maybe it's Pliny. I can't remember. Oh, that's embarrassing. But he, one of the authors in my book, points out that Crassus mourned the death of that eel more than he mourned, the death of 2 of his own children. And so, yeah, the ancients were definitely enamored of their pets. I think I told you just before we started, our dear barn cat, passed away. And I got to admit, I mean, that cat never came inside. It was always outside, but was a permanent fixture of our lives for, I think, close to 20 years. That's a long time for a cat. And we found it, my wife found it this morning, just curled up in the flower bed and just looked like it was asleep, but, it didn't wake up. I kind of felt sorry for that little cat. It was a pet that slept on the bed or anything, but yeah, you have affection for animals when you spend time with them.
Well, and I think for a lot of people, animals can kind of give that emotional support and non-judgment and unconditional love that sometimes it can just play such an important role in our lives and survival.
Right. There's some bumper sticker you see, like, if only I could be the person my dog is, or something like that, that animals are, in some ways superior to human beings. They're less complicated, but they somehow morally superior.
I really enjoyed that you kind of went back and forth between sort of historical descriptions and sort of kind of more factual scientific approaches, and then kind of intersped it with stories and myths and legends. And I thought that was kind of a nice way to sort of weave through the topic. But who are some of the other authors that you featured, and why did you choose them?
Great. Well, first, thanks for noticing that, because variety is the spice of life, and I really did want to give kind of a varied smorgasbord of information and approaches and perspectives, both chronologically and generically in terms of genre, what kind of writings. So good. I'm glad that came through, because that was part of the goal. So yeah, I had to write down some of the authors that are in there, because I can have, all right, we got Ovid, I've mentioned him already, a little vignette from the Metamorphoses, one particular myth, but that whole mythological poem is just, of course, packed full of human, at least a poetic reading or perspective on interspecies relationships, because most of the myths that he recounts are about the transformation of humans into animals, or occasionally animals into humans, for whatever reason. So that that's, I mean, you could read, I mean, Ovid is just like a textbook for this sort of topic in a way, looked at it through that lens. Pliny the Elder is in there a couple of times, two different passages, I believe, mostly on birds, I think, and birds and elephants is what I use Pliny for. But, the natural history is a gold mine for just all sorts of information, reliable and totally unreliable information about interspecies interaction, human-animal relationships, attitudes, and anecdotes about animals and encounters with animals. So yeah, Pliny was, de rigueur, I had to have him in there. One of my favorite passages in the whole collection is Aristotle's little exordium to scientific research at the beginning of Parts of Animals, where he says, we shouldn't be squeamish. We should study animals because they're nearer to our nature than, say, theology or the gods or something that's out there. There's something that empirically we can study because it's right in front of us, but also it's closer to our own nature, so that studying animals can teach us something about ourselves. At the end of that passage, he's got this absolutely incredible remark, incredible in two different ways. He says, we don't study animals and the parts of animals, say, how the function of the knee joint or something like that in a deer. We don't do that for its own sake, right? We do it for an understanding of the whole, how the part interacts with the whole. That is a really prescient observation on the part of Aristotle. I mean, here he's talking about reduction in science, looking at parts, because you have to look at parts, isolate them. How does that part move? But you can't stop there. And he says we need to, look at the bigger picture. To understand the systemic whole is the point of studying nature. Amazing. Basically, he's anticipating system science in that sentence. And he also, I think, all but coins the word ecology in that passage. And not just in that passage, he talks about it elsewhere. So, ecology means the study of, the house or the home. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as like the study of the environment that we live in. And, traditionally, or at least in the textbooks, they'll tell you that a guy named Ernst Haeckel coined that word in 1866, oikologia. But Aristotle, at the end of the passage I'm describing to you, and you've read, obviously, is saying, like, he analogizes that study of the whole, the systemic whole, to the study of a house. He says, just like a house, he says, it's not about the bricks and the mortar and the timber of the house. It's the whole construction that concerns somebody. And so, he's analogizing there from, household study to the study of nature, just like he coins the word oikonomia as well, economy, which is the similar derivation. Anyway, enough of that. That's in there.
Yeah, if we were talking about all the great things Aristotle's done, that would be a whole podcast in of itself. Yeah.
Oh, it's great. Elian is in there, and Elian is just a storyteller first and foremost, not much of a philosopher, but the stories he tells about animals, these little short vignettes of animal behavior, the strange behaviors, peculiarities of animals, I just love, and I latched onto a bunch of ones that had a shared theme of how animals get away, how they're conniving and tricky, and I enjoyed that. And then Aesop is in there, but Aesop, by way of somebody in later antiquity who retold Aesop, versified Aesopian fables. His name is Babrius. We don't know much about him. And so I've got some Aesop's fables in there.
Yeah, I really enjoyed those ones because I hadn't actually read those ones before too. So I was like, oh, it's kind of like, a new Aesop's for me.
Good. Yeah. So I have a couple favorites from there too. And then Plutarch is in there. And not like your boilerplate Plutarch, but I mean, Plutarch was a voluminous writer. So is there a boilerplate Plutarch? But it's not a biography. It's not a philosophical treatise. It is a philosophical treatise, but it's cast as an imaginary dialogue between one of the companions of Odysseus, a human companion whom Circe has turned into a pig. It's an interview between Odysseus and the pig. The pig is named Gryllus, which means oinker in Greek. And it's all about how, Odysseus wants to have him change back into a human being. And Grilla says, no, thank you. I would rather be a pig. And here are all the reasons why I think as a pig, the animals are superior to you human beings. So no, thank you. I'll stay the way I am. Thanks.
Well, I like that one quite a lot. I got to say, actually, one of my favorites was the octopus teacher, and I know it's extremely short, but it just, it's so beautiful and simple, and I wasn't expecting it, and I was like, oh, this is like a little delightful package.
Well, I tell you, you're my ideal reader because I'm glad you said that. It's like, I love that passage too. That's one of my, I couldn't not include it in there. I mean, it's a really amazing observation. He notices, or he reports, that octopods do change their color in like an amazing way. And anybody who has seen My Octopus Teacher, the Netflix thing, will immediately think, I know what he's talking about. But here in the 5th century BCE, somebody, or 6th century, somebody saw an octopus behaving just that way that Craig Foster saw when he had all his equipment on and, a film, and caught it on film, and we all watched it in our living room eating popcorn on the couch. Somebody, a Greek sponge diver probably, saw that. And then from that, Theognis analogizes to human behavior. We should be the same as the octopus and adapt to our situation to survive socially, just as the octopus does naturally. Can I just say one more thing about that passage? There's a disproportionately long footnote to that short poem that I think is, well, I think it's important. The idea is important, not the footnote. The idea is that the word ethics in English and in Greek comes from an earlier usage of the word ethos in Greek that's used in Homer and the poets. So before, like, say, philosophy or the prosification of Greek culture, when it was still very much a poetic culture. It meant the haunt or the lair of an animal. And that's the word that is used a couple of times by Theognis to say, adapt your ethos, which I translate, I think, as maybe disposition or character. It could be character, it could be attitude. There's no one way to translate it, but originally that meant, the physical environmental abode of any creature, not just an octopus. So, ethics really, I mean, you talk about environmental ethics, that's an oxymoron, right? I mean, ethics and the environment, one comes from the other. Human adaptability to one's environment is ethics.
That's absolutely fascinating. And, I thought about it when I was reading it too, that, people often say, oh, survival of the fittest, and that's the thing, but that's not the case. I mean, that's, you read Darwin, all that, it's survival of the most adaptable. And I think that's always an important lesson when we're trying to navigate our social society structures, family, work, but also our environments, everything. Like, humans and individuals can succeed if we know how to adapt in situations.
Yep.
So to remember that, to carry the octopus in your mind is a good lesson.
I have to say too, I mentioned this course that I'm teaching right now called How to Think About Animals, and we read Peter Kropotkin's book Mutual Aid. And Kropotkin was an early anarchist thinker, but he was also a pretty learned, self-taught scientist, at least a field naturalist, because he spent a lot of time as a geographer in Siberia before he was thrown in prison multiple times and renounced his princedom and all that, princehood. But he in Mutual Aid, he argues that, yes, I mean, it's not survival of the fittest is there in nature. There is competition for scarce resources in nature, but there's also a heck of a lot of cooperation amongst species for survival, cooperation for collective well-being and flourishing and perpetuation of genes and all the things that evolutionary biologists talk about. So yeah, I think that notion of adaptability is not just like personal, navigating your own way through a complex maze of the world and life, but rather it's also a social one, that it requires cooperation, interspecies cooperation. Well, no, that's what I mean. Intraspecies cooperation amongst humans, to be able to pull it off. And I don't think Theognis meant that. He was talking about leveraging it for perhaps your own personal social advantage. But be that as it may, your point.
Well, your next story in the book does prove that point, which is the quality of mercy, the story of the lion and the slave in the gladiator ring.
Oh, Androcles and the lion.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, touching story. It's I actually had a bit of a tear to my eye at the end of it. Maybe I'm just sensitive in these regards, but it was so beautiful, and that is a perfect example of interspecies cooperation.
Yeah, that is really, I agree. That has an element in it too, because it's such a utopian, wishful thinking kind of thing, and but beautiful. But it suggests maybe what the possibilities are for interspecies cooperation and affection. Is a lion really going to refrain from ripping apart a human being if it's really hungry in a cave? Well, probably not. But the fact that the human cares for the animal and takes the thorn from its paw, the animal leaves a hunk of meat there for the human to eat because he's an enslaved person living in a cave. He needs something to eat. He can't go out because it would be found. There's a lot of very touching elements about it. I know there's no doubt that was going on there in Aulus Gellius's mind, that it was a touching story, as you say, and trying to maximize that in the retelling of it.
Yeah, I could tell you didn't watch a lot of Tiger King during the pandemic.
I guess no. I did see one episode of that. Does he get eaten by the tiger in the end of that?
I actually only saw one episode too, because to me, like the fact that it was such a social phenomenon, I was like, I'm just curious to like what this is addressing in mass culture's needs at the moment. But it's another good dynamic between animals that, I mean, historically don't have that much relationship with humans, positively speaking.
Right. I mentioned this in the introduction. A film, since you mentioned films or audio, visual representations. The film by Werner Herzog called Grizzly Man. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that's an abject lesson in this aspirational wish to cross a line and become an animal or bond with an animal intimately goes wrong. And I won't say any more, but it's about grizzly bears and a guy who tried to live with the grizzlies. And it's a profound meditation on the nobility of the impulse to want that, and maybe the psychological reasons we humans want to cross that line in a way. I mean, we've crossed that line before because we've domesticated animals, right? A horse is a big, dangerous animal, but then also it's a meditation on ultimately, nature's indifference. And it's a tragedy. You should see it. You'd like it.
I'm putting it on the list. It is interesting though, you say like the noble aspirations of how we see animals, and it is another question I had for you, kind of going back to the Aesop's fables, but like, why do so many fables feature animals in the first place? Why do we tell moral stories and morality tales with things with tails? I mean, is it something maybe beyond just it's too moralizing if it's humans, or it appeals to children?
Or... Right, tales with tails. You should leverage that as a title of something. I like that.
I just came up with it. I was
really? Oh, good.
Yeah,
it's clever. It's a distancing effect. That's my first answer, I guess. I would say it's like Greek tragedy. Like, Greek tragedy was all about what was going on in the polis at the time. I mean, Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus before them both, they were writing, contemporary current events kind of plays, but they use mythological characters to, act out these things and put words on the lips of Antigones and Medeas and others. So it keeps it a little bit at arm's length, and it makes it safe to think about, or more congenial to think about. The human foibles and the human issues that are, maybe too close to home, or closer to home, and you're more ready to assimilate it if an animal is saying it or doing it, right? Because you can think, oh, it's just an animal, but then you think, is that like me, or is that like my brother, or is that like, so that second thought that I think tragedy can sometimes would bring out in an Athenian historical audience, like, maybe there's something to that. That sounds a lot like what's going on now. Animal fables, I think, can also do that.
It's funny. I usually use the classics for the same purpose. Like, if you have these really hot topic issues going on in our current society, and you try to have a discussion, and it becomes almost impossible because everyone's so emotive about it. But then if you bring up almost the exact same situation 2,000 years ago, you can usually have a more productive and constructive dialogue about basically the same problem.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in that instance, the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's probably something actually historically accurate about that. I mean, the human equation, the human element in the equation doesn't really change all that much. I mean, at least some aspects of it doesn't change. So you're going to find history, quote unquote, repeating itself in that way that you described. With animals, it's almost like it's even more of a, what do you want to say? Bertolt Brecht called it Verfremdung. How does that defamiliarization? A defamiliarization process, because humans aren't animals and animals aren't humans, so there's not even it's even further distanced in a way. It's like scapegoating, right? I mean, the Old Testament thing of throwing all your human sins onto a poor goat and kicking it out into the desert and thinking, hey, I mean, there's like an actual ritualization of that kind of distancing effect that we do all the time, every day. And I think using animal fables is a nice way to do that.
Now, a lot of the vignettes and things are maybe what one would expect to find in your book, like Aesop's fables and Aristotle and Pliny. But one I was a little surprised I had not anticipated was Seneca. And I thought that Seneca's contribution to the conversation I just hadn't heard him mention that before. And I just thought maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit what Seneca sort of mentioned about animals.
Good. So in that passage that you're talking about, it's letter 60 to Lucilius, short letter. Seneca is primarily saying, like, why do you do what everyone tells you to do, Lucilius? Lucilius is his friend and kind of protege. So why do you just do what other people want for you? Why don't you just like take charge of what you know is important? And he opens the letter with talking about like prayer, and that the prayers that our family has for us are, they don't know what's best for us. They actually can work against what's really in our best interest because they're not in accordance with nature. And the big Stoic premise is to live according to nature. What does that mean? Live according to the confines of the natural world. In one sense, yes, true. So live according to the laws of nature. Don't exceed them. That's a human prerogative and a requirement. But also live according to our nature as human beings. And so the Stoics were concerned about defining what human nature is. And ultimately, they say that what differentiates us from animals. And here, it's different from the Porphyry's argument. He says the Stoics, and Seneca was a Stoic, says that human beings have reason. And so to act according to our nature, we must always act according to the dictates of reason and not emotion or any other, sort of impulse that does affect us as a human animal, but that reason must dictate how we behave and how we act. So he compares humans unfavorably by not acting according to reason, by acting perhaps according to the wishes of others, like your parents or people who wish you well but don't really know philosophically what's the right thing to do, that we act contrary to nature more often than not, whereas animals always act according to nature, right? And they live within their means. They live within the compass of their means. So whether it be a giant elephant, or a tiny mouse, he doesn't use that example, but they understand their place. And knowing your place, the old Delphic oracle, know thyself, knowing thy place is also an important part of a Stoic concept that this letter, is skirting. It doesn't address it directly, but it's skirting. And that concept is oikeosis, knowing your place in nature. I translate that as proprioception, which is a word that means like your body works, your body parts. You almost instinctively know where your hands are, so you can type on a keyboard. You know how to crack an egg without breaking it because just the right amount of pressure. These things that we almost take for granted. I think the Stoics said that we should be living in the world morally, ethically, in the same kind of way towards the natural world and towards one another. It's a huge concept. I probably won't exhaust it here, but in that letter, I think he adumbrates this larger question of oikeosis.
My takeaway is that you're clearly better at cooking than I am, because I always get the eggsheller. No, but that's really, yes, you're right. That is to be expanded on another day, because there's quite a lot to be said in that. And it'd be fun to get like a bunch of Stoics together to discuss about how exactly we're supposed to fit in with our nature, and
Right.
that would be fun. So I was going to ask, so kind of to take a step back and look at the big picture of this book, the concept, the project. How does learning about what the ancients felt about animals teach us how we should treat animals?
Well, again, I think it's a perspective from a time where people were more closely related to animals. And, I don't know about you, but I like to get things from the source. I go, the old rallying cry, ad fontes, go to the source for something. I mean, they're not the only source, of course, but they're a source that's close to hand for me. And so I find it refreshing just to hear how other people in the past who were more dependent on the natural world, relatively speaking, and more dependent on animals, talked about them, thought about them, felt about them. I mean, there's also a lot of feeling and emotion that we have toward animals, our fellow creatures. And so that is instructive just in and of itself, for me, I think. Especially because a lot of what we have to do now is sort of rehabilitate our sensibilities. We're humans after all. We haven't become unhuman by this hyper technologizing of our culture and our daily lives. But it seems like we have to make an effort to kind of recover it. Whether you're living in the city or on 125 acres, we all need to do it. And so the imaginaries of the past can help us with that. I think I don't know about you. What about you?
Well, yeah, I think I like that answer. I feel like that that our ability to treat animals, and this was going to kind of lead to my next question for you, actually, kind of reveals a lot about ourselves. And even in the most extreme ways, you find people who like torture animals are usually like the first sign of being psychopaths and stuff like that. But that, I guess, is the more that we think about it and our relationship with animals, the more we can be in touch with ourselves and our nature, and like you say, like be living with nature. But I think it can also help cultivate empathy and discipline, responsibility, like a lot of the qualities that can kind of make us good, virtuous people. In some ways, we learn those lessons when we're young often, but throughout our lives by how we interact with animals.
That's beautifully put. You just answered your own question, or if it was a question, that was like perfect. I would add to that maybe gratitude. That uh, you know, I don't know if you know, or my wife and I also run a farm. We didn't grow up, we weren't to the manor born kind of thing. We weren't farm families. It was a big ideological thing, and we wanted to get back to the land, blah, 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 blah. But over the 25 years we've been doing this, and it's more than just a toy gentlemanly, I'm not a gentleman, but more than a hobby farm, let's just say. It's you learn a lot about, like, for me personally, like how impatient I am. I mean, to be a farmer and a livestock rearer, you have to have the patience of Job. I mean, it's just like you cannot force anything in nature. You have to cooperate. You're like it's not like you're passive, you're an active participant, but you just can't make things happen. As much as we do manufacture landscapes, we change landscapes, we improve them. I think sometimes, when you return a brushy, unusable area to a beautiful pasture, that's good. I think, but at the same time, it's like you're not really in control. You're responding, and animals definitely teach you that. Just think about like a sheepdog rounding up a herd of sheep. Every time I see that happen, you've probably seen it on, video or maybe in person. It is just jaw-dropping, the awe that inspires. The fact that dog can resist its own instinct to eat those sheep, can respond to its master, who's giving it sometimes just barely audible commands and sometimes just gestures, can read the master or the farmer shepherd to do what it's told over sometimes really great distances. Like, we're not talking like a little paddock, we're talking like on a fell or something. That kind of interactions, the livestock, the dog to the livestock, the dog to the absolutely beautiful. It's like it's mind-blowing. And it gives you sort of a gratitude and a reverence for the world that we live in, and that's a natural world. I mean, it's a kind of technology because we've domesticated that animal, the dog and the sheep, and we are using them to our advantage, right? But also not to their own disadvantage, because if you're a good farmer, you're going to be treating all your animals well and give them the best lives possible. But that whole thing, it just cultivates, as you say, virtue. It's a virtue in and of itself to interact with the world in that way. The virtue of a farmer, it's almost like inbred, it's native. It doesn't stop there, of course. You need to many other things, but there's something about that's just like, so, to me, so human and so sacred and so incredible.
That's very well put. It might be one more thing I would add, and I think that is because animals have a shortened lifespan compared to us. It's another way for us, I think, to make peace with death. And maybe this brings full circle to your barn cat. May she rest in peace. That for, especially when we're children, but throughout our lives, death is inevitable. But when we can see it and process it and kind of find ritual and meaning in it in these small ways through our pets and the animals that we depend on and the animals that we eat, then we can kind of make an acceptance with the sort of the inevitable that looms in all our lives.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's also well said. That's a great way to end. I mean, it's true. There's an old philosophical trope that, philosophy is a rehearsal for death. Like, a philosopher is concerned with preparing for that time. Your whole life is leading up to your death to have a good death. And yeah, as you just put it, animals kind of are primer along the way for us. When we treat them well and when we care for them and take care for them, we lose them. But it is. I mean, it doesn't trivialize a human death to say that. It's another form of kind of, I don't know, not distancing, but just a way of reconciling what we experience as humans vicariously, in a way, through the animal.
Yeah, it's like a way to practice empathy, I suppose. It's to but well, Mark, I want to say thank you. I know you've been so generous with your time, and so maybe this is a good point to end. But I'll put your links to your book below because I would highly recommend it. I think it's a beautiful and enjoyable book, and I think we always support the examined life. So examining our relationship with all these species that we coexist with is a wonderful place to start.
Great. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.